Democrats in the U.S. still in turmoil. We will speak to New York Times columnist and podcast host Ezra Klein. Israeli politics machinations prompt the weekly question, will Netanyahu's coalition survive? There's a new government in the U.K. Boy, do those guys move fast. It's unholy. I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. It's unholy. 2 Jews on the news. It's lots of news here, I've got to say. We're sometimes a bit deprived in the news department compared to everywhere else in the world, but we are really bringing it. We're bringing our A game.
It's coming home, I would say, with the news,
nice
isn't
reference. Previous guest, David Baddiel, who wrote that song, It's Football's Coming Home. Look, early to say, because the final is on Sunday, so we don't yet know, but amazingly, England got through. I know this very stuttering start at the beginning of the tournament. You know, they couldn't really fire, and they came from behind 3 times. Some of us might be thinking, is there a column to be done on lessons learned from the football that read across to the politics? Because both have come together in quite a major way. All I will say is this. When you ask Keir Starmer, Britain's new prime minister, who his favourite Labour leader is, he always says Harold Wilson. Often forgotten figure, very pro-Israel leader of the British Labour Party, prime minister in the 60s and 70s. Key fact about him, he was the prime minister the last time England won at any international tournament. The reason why people talk about, it's coming home is England have not won anything since 1966. So all the other major teams, the Germanys, the France, the Spain, they win all the time. But England haven't done it. And so the pressure is enormous and the symbolism will be very, very big if 1 week into a new government, the big trophy does come home of winning the European Championships currently in Germany.
We will know this on Sunday, as you say. Not that I'm not fascinated by football, but could we go back just a little bit to the politics of this? I mean, as an Israeli watching, there's a British new prime minister appointed. The elections are on Thursday. There's a new government on Friday. To us, it kind of seems like you guys are cheating, right? It's a 3 or 4 week election cycle. Just to give you the perspective on this, Netanyahu won an election November 1st, 2022. Homogenous, simple coalition. It took him 2 months. The government was sworn on December 29th. This is how long. If you sum up all the coalition negotiations in Israel in 75 years, it will be 2 years. So the fact that you guys did it in 24 hours is just is pretty remarkable.
It is one of the virtues of a first past the post system rather than PR, and also a parliamentary system. So the Americans have first past the post, but presidential. We know all the problems there, and a 3-month transition. In Israel, obviously PR, and there's always horse trading. It's very, very clean, clinical, almost brutal, actually, that it happens in a matter of hours. So in the early hours of Friday morning, I was up along with everyone else who does the kind of jobs you and I do, Yonit, watching these returns coming in, watching Tory members of parliament, Conservative members of parliament, and government ministers falling like 9 pins, including with huge symbolism, nearly at 7 o'clock in the morning, former Prime Minister Liz Truss losing in her own rock-solid seat in the English countryside. I'd actually been there reporting just on the off chance that would be an earthquake event, and it so proved to be. And then, by 10 o'clock in the morning, I was down in Downing Street watching Rishi Sunak first come out and make a very gracious speech, actually. And here's a key point. What I think that other countries might envy is not just the speed, but the peaceful, uncontested transfer of power, which would once have seemed very routine, and we definitely did take it for granted, now seems something to be cherished, because there was Rishi Sunak. He comes to the outside Downing Street, to the lectern, and pays tribute to Keir Starmer. He said, I know him to be a public-spirited, good man, and then says his successes will be our successes. He goes to the palace. An hour later, meets the king, says, I'm resigning. About an hour later, Keir Starmer appears before the very same lectern as now the prime minister. That's it. By Friday morning, no one's had even a night's sleep. And the speed of it is obviously very enviable, but I think just that, the uncontested, seamless nature of it, and ministers paying tribute to other ministers. The outgoing finance minister, the chancellor, said, he told his kids, don't be disappointed.
Give him the full title, please.
The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, outgoing Chancellor of the Exchequer, did this brilliant speech, actually, at his count, where he was re-elected as an MP, but knew he was losing the election and would no longer be in government. And he said to his children, addressing his children, don't be upset by this. This is the magic of democracy. And I thought that was rather wonderful. So we're all in feeling pretty good at the moment, because obviously it's looking awful everywhere else. But here, Britain just pulled off a very good election and a government that, I, for one, am very glad to see in place.
Yeah, not exactly the Donald Trump transferal of power, what you described right now. I think another thing, and I was really thinking about this a lot as I saw, and you said the word enviable. It really is. I envied all of the sort of elegance and the swiftness of how the way that this happened. Look, at the end of the day, I think the difference between our systems is that English democracy is a lot about governability, right, and stability. And that is what you described. In Israel, the representativity, the fact that everyone has to be represented, right? That is something that Ben-Gurion wanted, our founding father. So you're going to look at the legislator, and you're going to have, two parties for the ultra-Orthodox, 2 different parties for the religious Zionists, 4 different parties for the Arabs, because everyone needs to be represented. It's very difficult to have universal representativity and that kind of stability. I think we might be the nation that proves that. But I did have an interesting, and I talked to you last week about the UK elections in Israel, and you rightfully pointed out that maybe that's not the most important thing on the agenda. But actually, there were a few independents running solely on this story of Gaza and challenging the big parties, in some places having, quite succeeding in this. So I'm wondering about that, and obviously generally we're already hearing a kind of change of tone in the Labour government vis-a-vis Israel. But all that is, to me, really interesting.
Yeah. So we'll come to the government point. On those individual contests, it's quite true. There are now 5 members of parliament out of 650. Right. So, 5 in Israel would be the kingmaker, 120
right.
seats. 5 out of 650 seats who were elected
Can still give Starmer a headache.
Well, his majority is so enormous. I mean, his majority is 172, depending on exactly how you count it. I don't mean he's got 172 seats. He has 411 seats in a 650 parliament. It just means he has got, if all the other parties combine, which they wouldn't, but if they all combined against him, he still beats them in a vote by 172 votes. So he can really do pretty much what he wants. But the significance of these 4 or 5 really, seats is as a warning of what could be down the road in the future. A challenge particularly from, and the shorthand has become the sort of pro-Gaza left. So one of those 5 was Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party, who stood as an independent. Keir Starmer had kicked him out of the Labour Party over allegations of anti-Semitism, we should say. That's what it was about. There was a statutory body and did an inquiry, found the party had fallen down on the issue of dealing with anti-Semitism. Corbyn, by then the former leader, rejected the findings of that commission, and Keir Starmer booted him out of the party. He ran as an independent. He won his own seat. Gaza was part of that, but it was also partly he'd been there 41 years, had a huge local following. In 4 other places, Muslim candidates in very largely Muslim community areas ran against Labour and won. And there the message was absolutely centrally about Gaza. But what the conversations I've had this week have been on these lines, saying, don't make the mistake a lot of people are making, which is thinking that once Gaza is in the rearview mirror and is not an issue in, say, the 2029 election, they're making that assumption. Don't assume this goes away, not because they'll press other forms of the Palestine issue. Rather, there is a whole cluster of issues in the Muslim communities of Britain in which they feel taken for granted for years, that they don't feel they get a fair shake, and that this was building up for a long time, waiting for an outlet, and they now have it in the form of those independent candidacies. There were some pretty ugly scenes, bullying, intimidation on the campaign trail in a lot of places. A couple of women who did win, Labour women, who were particularly targeted. So it was not, there are people warning, could this be the beginning of a kind of communalist or sectarian politics? The most likely thing, I think, is you will see Labour quietly trying to rebuild bridges and repair relationships with Muslim communities, perhaps in other areas, not just focusing on Gaza. But to your point about the government's changing rhetoric, it's true there's been a few nods about, David Lammy, the new Labour Foreign Secretary, saying that, reiterating his calls for an immediate ceasefire. There is, talk as there was going into the campaign about British recognition of a Palestinian state. I would say what I was sort of saying last time we talked about this, which is some of the emphases may be different in here and there, but overall you are looking at a government whose position would be no different from a mainstream sort of Chuck Schumer Democrat. It's a two-state position that's absolutely clear on Israel's need for security and stability, and yes, does want to see eventually two states side by side. But I think that's the international consensus. I think the wing of Labour that would have wanted a much firmer stance is going to be quieter. One thing that maybe some people will not be happy about is signals from Britain that it will drop the previous government's opposition to arrest warrants from the International Criminal Court issued against Benjamin Netanyahu and others. Some signals that Britain will not stand in the way of that. And the previous government under Rishi Sunak had suggested it would. That would be a change. Again, I would say this position is anchored in difference in emphasis, but it's still absolutely on the sort of two-state point, and it's not anything you could call meaningfully anti-Israel.
We want to also say something about the elections in France, which we left off last time. We talked to Ruth El-Krief, who's a prominent fixture of French television. Also, as she described, came out as a Jew, and we talked about that choice between the far right and the far left. We thought we were talking about what we were looking at was a triumph of the far right, and of course the other scenario happened with this upset. I mean, this is just for the Jewish community to think of walking between this one party that has candidates and supporters who think the Holocaust didn't exist and the other party that has candidates and supporters who think that Israel shouldn't exist. Just that kind of choice is a very complicated one.
Yeah, no, we heard it, didn't we, from Ruth last week, that sense of being between a rock and a hard place. In the end, from the Jewish community's point of view in France, their worst nightmares weren't realised. They aren't looking at an outright landslide win for the right or an outright landslide win for the far left. Instead, the centrist party, where a lot of Jewish votes, I suspect, did better than had been anticipated. And for now, there is a lack of clarity, there is confusion, but there is no overall majority of either one of the two sides that they perhaps feared. And so there again, the question becomes, okay, did the French Republic just have a very close shave? Well, yes, clearly. But does that mean that this has been the peak of those extreme parties and things will go back to some kind of normal? Or, and I think this is probably more likely, does it really take just one more heave for some of those forces? I mean, Marine Le Pen, yes, she didn't get it this time, but you look at the graph of the number of seats since about 2007, they go up at every single election cycle. They're knocking on the door, and, it could be the presidential election next time where, it won't be Macron on the ballot and Marine Le Pen wins it. That is talked about seriously. So I think they're out of it for now, but they're not out of the woods yet. So we made the point of the contrast, certainly between what goes on in Britain and what happens in Israel. Nothing quick yet, but you did, Yonit, tell us that July is the key month, and it's just this matter of running down the clock, of getting to that crucial day towards the end of July. If he gets there, then the Knesset breaks up and he's sort of in the clear for the summer. So where does that stand?
I mean, the interesting thing that came out, from the political perspective this week, is that there were reports actually on our channel 12, that Netanyahu is yet again considering firing Defense Minister Gallant. We should remind our listeners he's running very independently from this government, definitely like a free agent who's challenging Netanyahu in the open, something you don't do in the Likud of this era. And it was interesting to see if what this leak was about either kind of an attempt to rein Gallant in, which obviously is not going to be very successful, or sort of a kind of trial balloon to see what the response is. But interestingly enough, what the leak was about timing more than anything else. And Netanyahu plans to do this during the recess. Remember, there's, as you mentioned, a Knesset recess between the end of July and the end of October, thus thinking that at that time, the sort of political system is dormant and won't, wake up due to this. We can also remind our listeners what happened last time. Netanyahu tried to fire Gallant March of last year during the judicial overhaul. That didn't go down well with the Israeli public, who took to the streets. I think the atmosphere is very much of a government unraveling. And every sort of political pundit you would talk to would either say to you, even if Netanyahu survives this session in July, the huge problem this government has, namely the issue of the ultra-Orthodox and the draft bill, is coming back in October. And if the parts of the coalition will feel, particularly the Itamar Ben-Gvir, the far rights will feel that they have more power, stepping out of the government and going to elections, that's what you're going to see. So it's still a very unstable government at this point. Again, this week was dominated by the news of perhaps a hostage deal. We've been talking about this for a few weeks, 7.5 months after the last hostage deal. There are 120 Israeli hostages still held. Israel thinks that at least half of them are still alive. This week, Netanyahu issued his red lines. And by the way, in his name, not sources around the prime minister, but actually Netanyahu himself. In some quarters, this was seen as an attempt to torpedo the talks. And more, the sort of focus on Netanyahu himself as being the person responsible and having to make this decision. We talked about this a lot, right? How this might topple his government. On the other side, so much public pressure inside Israel and outside Israel to just get this deal done and take these people who are, civilians, did nothing wrong, kidnapped from their own house and bring them back home.
I mean, that point about torpedoing the hostage negotiations and what you were saying before about the election timing, they are, of course, linked. And it's an awful thing to contemplate. But that was very striking that just before another round of negotiations or talks begin, to sabotage them by issuing a series of red lines, internally security officials on the Israeli side saying, we are being sabotaged by the prime minister, as you say, in his own name. Part of the motivation, as we've been saying before, is because he knows that if there is a big return of hostages, that will symbolically at least make people feel, okay, now that's done, we need to have a new government. And that's a day of reckoning that he has been brilliantly, but in my view, appallingly, putting off since October the 7th, which is twofold. One, actually the ballot box, a national election, but also a proper inquiry into what happened on October the 7th. That's the can he needs to keep kicking down the road. And if it takes torpedoing, sabotaging, talks to bring them home, he'll do it. And I think that's, shocking, but true. And so these two stories, this wait that we have for some kind of breakthrough on hostage deal and his need to survive through July, they are appallingly and tragically linked.
And if you're talking about the link, there's a direct threat, right, by his far right members of coalition, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, saying, if you go to this deal and this deal stops the war, we're not in this government. Like it's a direct threat. So it's not guesswork here. But you mentioned the Commission of Inquiry. And I think it's a good moment to mention, we're talking on Thursday afternoon. Tonight, the first sort of substantial investigation, internal investigation by the military of what happened on October 7th will be published to the public. It has to do with the tragedy of Kibbutz Be'eri. And from what has been, first of all, this is still 9 months later. The biggest question of all, right? Okay, obviously Israeli intelligence failed, but why did the Israeli military fail? And why wasn't the Israeli military there to protect Israeli citizens? That is a black hole of a question that we still don't know the answer to, or the clear answer to. So this will be a piece of the puzzle. And from what has been leaked, and remember Kibbutz Be'eri, about 1,000 people, 1 out of 10 were murdered on October 7th. 101 residents of Be'eri were murdered. 29 were abducted into Gaza. 11 are still there. And what essentially is clear, right, that the army failed. There was an elite unit that did arrive at the scene 9:30, right? Remember, this whole thing started at 6:30 a.m. Was there, but more protecting the perimeters and not actually enter the kibbutz, but then sort of retreated. And that means that for 3 hours, the residents of Be'eri were left unprotected. it's heartbreaking and it's frustrating and it's enraging to go through what is, and as I said, the more details will come out later today, but just thinking of what happened on that day. And again, just the beginnings of these pieces of a whole puzzle.
Important difference, of course, is that the Israeli military from the top have said from the beginning, we take responsibility for this terrible thing and we will be held accountable. That speech, those words have never come out of Netanyahu's mouth. And that is a difference between the civilian and military branch. The other thing we, of course, should say is the war itself in Gaza is not, we're not talking in the past tense. There were 29 Palestinians killed in a strike on a tent camp east of Khan Yunis. The IDF says it's investigating what happened there. Meanwhile, yet another one of those orders, those guidance issued to civilians to leave Gaza City. The important point about both those places are these are places where, according to the logic of the campaign, those places have been sort of cleared out of Hamas. And yet here, the IDF is obviously still thinks there is military action that has to be taken in these places. And it makes me think, something I've thought for, obviously from the start, really, the notion of the total victory, that the eradication of Hamas as a fighting force. I have, long thought it's illusory, but I think we're seeing it. The proof there that areas, and it's happened in other parts of Gaza too, areas that were officially sort of ticked off, as in, right, we've got rid of Hamas, it props back up again. And this makes me feel on some level, this is going to be an attritional war that will go on and on and on. I mean, not measured in weeks and months, but why would this ever stop? Unless you believe that somehow the IDF can pull out of a place and Hamas won't go back. They will go back. And they have been doing that. And so the deadline that Prime Minister Netanyahu sets himself, which is the war will be over once we've completely eradicated Hamas, I think it's a mirage. It's an illusion.
Well, remember what Daniel Hagari, IDF spokesperson, said a few weeks ago, right? He said, anyone saying Hamas is an idea, whoever thinks it's possible to make it disappear is mistaken. I think Israel, if it had framed it the right way, right? This is for a longer conversation, but said, look, the war against terror in the West Bank took 3 years, but we managed to eradicate that. This is going to be a long operation. This is what we plan to do. At the end, we are going to transfer power to whatever Palestinian, group that we decide should take the power and the reins in Gaza. I think it would have been a different kind of story. We're now 9 months into this. By the way, official statements by Netanyahu himself saying we are going to end the intensive part of the campaign, but it's very clear that the whole discussion of the day after is not formalized in Israel's mindset yet.
No, and you made the crucial point about who we would hand power to. The parallel that you make about the West Bank in the 2003 period is there was a Palestinian authority there. There was a plausible structure where you could imagine Israel doing what it had to do, then pulling out, and there's an authority there. That scenario is exactly what's missing in the Gaza case. So that is the situation in Israel and Gaza. As we've been noting, it does go on and on. But throughout all of it, the importance of the relationship with Israel of the United States, the support it has been getting from the Biden administration has been a key part of the story. And that story has itself changed in the last 2 or 3 weeks, not in terms of his support, but in terms of the precariousness of the position of the incumbent president. He did that TV debate. You and I both covered it as it happened. We talked about it on here. And his position politically has been fragile ever since, which is one reason particularly why we wanted to talk to this week's guest, because this is something he's not just been following, but he was very, very early onto this topic and so many others.
Ezra Klein is a New York Times columnist, a political commentator, and host of the Ezra Klein Show podcast. He's been in media for a very long time, Vox and blogs and the Washington Post, but he's only just turned 40. Or in the words of Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman, Ezra is very, very good and very, very young, end quote.
To be fair, Ezra, you said that when I was much younger.
Not much younger, by the way, but it's still a very good quote. I'm running with it. What do you
Thank
care?
You.
We're really glad to have you on.
I feel a lot older these days by the day here.
Anyway, I'm keeping that quote. I'm going to use, you can use it Did I remind you of that, or did you remember that quote very well?
I remember a quote like that, but it's funny to be reminded that I was once young for my job, and now feel the weight of both my age and a series of crushing political disappointments that follow me wherever I go.
Disappointments are life. So anyway, we're really glad to have you on. And we want to start, if we may, with the debate night. When we were all scrolling our social media posts, I think one of the funniest things I read was someone saying, I think we all owe Ezra Klein an apology. And the reason for that is that about 4 months ago, you wrote a column saying that Democrats have a better option than Biden, claiming essentially that he is too old. You like him, he's a good president, but enough is enough. And you got a lot of, I assume, criticism, fury in the Democratic Party. I wonder, by the way, if any of them apologized.
There was a fair amount of, I'll call it inbox traffic, to not reveal any private conversations. What I will say is the reaction to that piece in February, which was, as you suggest, more explosive than my average piece, because I both did this sort of big audio essay then, because what I was really saying was not just that Biden shouldn't run again, but that an open convention, as unusual as that sounded to Democrats at the time, was both a viable and preferable option. I then did a long interview with Elaine Kamarck, who's an expert on Democratic Party rules, about what an open convention would look like. I just re-released that if people want to listen to it on my show. And then I did a sort of, listener questions hour about it. So I pushed it pretty hard at that moment. And what I saw in response is interesting given the arguments President Biden is making this week, which is normie Democrats, and this was reflected in the polling at that time too, were like, thank God somebody is saying this. Thank you for saying this. How do we make this happen? Who do I call? Whereas Democratic elites, those very elites that Joe Biden is currently blaming for his troubles, were very resistant. In public, a lot of them shouted me down, called me a bedwetter and panicking. In private, they were often more thoughtful than that, but they were, too afraid of doing anything. Can Kamala Harris do it? It's too soon. We don't have the muscles of party to do something like this. So the voters have been here for a long time. I mean, months before the debate, 70% of voters in the Times Siena polls said that Joe Biden was too old to be an effective president. It's been Democratic elites who've been trying to ignore the voters on this one. So one of my columns post-debate has simply been that the debate really didn't change what voters thought of Joe Biden. It has changed the ability of the Democratic Party to continue ignoring what voters thought of Joe Biden. And I think that's still the thing that the party is wrestling with, this gap between where the electorate is and how hard it is to do anything about where the electorate is.
So what's your read now of where that wrestling ends? Does it end with lots of grumbling, lots of mumbling, and in fact Biden almost fatally wounded as a candidate but still not forced out? Or is your read that in the end, those shy Democrats who are saying to you and other people privately what they think but aren't acting on it, in the end they do come out and say enough's enough? What's your read of where this lands?
Let me say as a caveat and a warning to the two of you as people, to your listeners, I'm just an incredibly annoying person to talk to. And this answer is going to be incredibly annoying to hear, which is, this is all probabilistic, and it always has been. And I think the huge mistake the party's been making is thinking in binaries, right? The argument I made back in February was a probabilistic argument that if you were watching Joe Biden, what you were seeing was he had skipped the Super Bowl interview as he did the year before. Very unusual for a candidate behind in the polls to do. He was doing very few interviews, very few press conferences. The interviews he was doing were very tightly scripted and controlled, very friendly places to go. Then at the press conference he held in an impromptu way to rebut the special counsel report that questioned his memory, he had a memory lapse, right? Not a huge one, nothing crazy. Mixing up Egypt and Mexico isn't the end of the world. But even there, where all he had to do was validate for the electorate that he was still cognitively capable of the job, he wasn't able to do that. And so my basic argument then was that you shouldn't look at what he is doing right now and think that he can sustain what you need to do in a campaign day after day after day, that the probability of him having bad days between February and November was simply too high. Now, that's basically exactly what has been happening. They've been keeping him on a very tightly scripted campaign. The moment he went unscripted at the debate, he fell apart. So right now, I also think what's happening in the Democratic Party is very uncertain. You're dealing with, again, it could break out lots of ways. I'm not going to tell you where it's going to end up because it also depends what happens with Joe Biden. I don't know when this will release, but he's about to give a press conference after the NATO summit. He's giving an interview to Lester Holt. I don't know if those will be long or they'll be short. He has done a very limited number of unscripted events since the debate, which you might have expected otherwise, given the fears he had to allay. So he did an interview with George Stephanopoulos that they wanted to keep to 15 minutes. It ran to about 22 minutes, but he did a frankly terrible job in that interview. It wasn't as catastrophic as a debate, but it was a terrible job for such a high stakes thing that was so where you could do so much preparation, right? He did 2 very friendly radio shows where the host would accept pre-submitted questions by his campaign. And he also didn't perform that well in those interviews. And then he did a call-in for about 18 minutes to Morning Joe, which has been a very friendly place. So we are not seeing a Biden who is able to perform effectively at the moment. There's a question of how few performances his team can get away with in order to limit the possibility of him having a bad performance and still allay Democratic fears. Democrats are themselves now going through this process of, on the one hand, they do not feel he has answered their questions. They do not feel in Congress that he has proven that he is a strong candidate, but he has done just enough, and his fury has been significant enough to stay their hand on trying to challenge him. A lot of them are in a position of resignation and fatalism. They believe he should step aside. They have no lever they can pull or push to make him step aside. And so they're kind of resigned to falling in line behind a potentially fatally flawed candidate. I just consider this situation very unstable, right? If you were making the bet, odds are he's probably the nominee, but I wouldn't give it very strong odds. Nancy Pelosi, given this sort of very ambiguous statement suggesting that, well, he should take longer to decide, maybe. The fact that the bleeding hasn't stopped, that Michael Bennet came out for the senator from Colorado on CNN, said he doesn't think Joe Biden can win the election. What you're seeing here is a party that has not gotten enough information to do something very difficult, which is try to push Joe Biden aside, to defect from him en masse, knowing that those defections will weaken him if he decides to stay in the race. But at the same time, the party's not gotten the information to unite again behind him. So it's all very, it's very, very fragile.
Because one of the things you also did recently was a column and a podcast episode about Kamala Harris. And if you try to distill the reason why she hasn't managed to win Americans over, there are all kinds of reasons in that episode. I'm curious what you think, and if you think there's still time to change that.
I think Harris is interesting. I think she's underrated. I don't know how underrated. The very quick gloss I'd give of her career is, and I'm Californian, I'm talking to you from San Francisco, which is where her political career begins. She is a law and order Democrat, a moderate Black law and order Democrat in California. She releases this book, Smart on Crime, right? The point is she's sort of compassionate, but she's also a serious prosecutor who, understands her job in the way that, that sort of class of politicians and prosecutors understood their job in that era, which is dealing with crime, trying to make crime less frequent, trying to address the root causes of crime. What then happens is she's sort of rocketed into political stardom. This is a sort of post-Obama era. She is elected in 2016 as Hillary Clinton loses. She is a Black woman Democrat with a lot of star power. There's a real hope she can be the future of the party. So the expectations for her are very high. She runs in 2020, but she runs at a time in this post-Ferguson, this Black Lives Matter moment when the Democratic Party does not want a tough on crime, pro-cop candidate. So she sort of abandons the only political identity she has really known. And what she's not able to do in that campaign is come up with a new one. Who is Kamala Harris if she's not the prosecutor, the district attorney, the person she's been for her whole career? She doesn't really figure that out. And so she performs fine. She has some good moments in the debates, some not so good moments. But she performs well enough that then in the post-George Floyd moment, Joe Biden picks her as vice president. Now, the vice presidency is also a position that is death to somebody's political identity, right? You are subsumed to the identity of the president, the views of the president, the words of the president. Your goal in life is to not make the president look bad. It is not to make yourself look good. In fact, to make yourself look too good will be frowned upon and seen as stepping out in front of the president, particularly an older president of the way Joe Biden is. So you basically have a politician whose political identity has been muddied, profoundly muddied 2 times over. First in this 2020 pivot, then in this vice presidential role. We don't really know who Kamala Harris would run as, who she would be in 2024. Frankly, moderate, tough on crime, Black Democrat against Donald Trump isn't the craziest profile, right? If she were not vice president, if she'd not run in 2020, you can imagine a lot of people in the Democratic Party being like, oh, if only we had Kamala Harris. She's, I think, a more talented politician than people think. She nevertheless has real weaknesses as a politician. She has not proven herself able to win in places like Pennsylvania. So we don't know. But I would say at this moment, a lot of people in the party believe that her upside is more significant than Joe Biden's upside. She polls about the same as him, in some cases maybe a little bit better than him. And there's reason to believe that she could be introduced to the public with a good vice presidential pick in a way that would improve her numbers quite a bit. Whereas Biden is very stuck because people have had a long time to form quite concrete impressions of him.
So I take your earlier point about probabilities, that we're talking about only about probabilities. One hunch I have is that if the Democrats allow themselves to go through what for them would feel like the trauma of deposing an incumbent president as nominee, their appetite for upheaval will be so diminished that they'll then just cling to Kamala Harris because they couldn't bear the prospect of a contested convention and an open contest. That's my hunch, that they'll feel as if we've had enough drama. Now let's just go for something solid. Just on that point, what measure do you have for the appetite there would be, should Biden be edged aside, for an actual contest, or is it just a coronation of Kamala Harris?
I've written about this. I've talked to people in the party on this. I think the most interesting thing here that happened was that Jim Clyburn, who's a co-chair of Joe Biden's campaign, was asked in the hypothetical that Joe Biden steps aside, if there should be basically a coronation or a contest. And he says, if we did that, we should have a mini primary. I don't think the Democratic Party has enough confidence in Kamala Harris to simply coronate her. I think they'd be right not to coronate her, as I argued in a column on this. What the Democratic Party has allowed Joe Biden to deny them, what they've denied themselves in not having a primary to test where Joe Biden was as a campaigner, given his age, what they denied themselves in not demanding to see more of him out in unscripted situations, was information. They have been operating with a tremendous absence of information this whole time. Then the debate offered a lot of information all of a sudden, and people are freaking out in the aftermath of it. They will need more information to get to a point where Biden's actually stepping aside. But if they get to that point, I don't think they're going to want to make the same mistake twice. I think there is a feeling that among many that it'd be good for the party, even exciting, to see its bench of younger talent out there making the case against Donald Trump, making the case for themselves. You imagine Kamala Harris and Pete Buttigieg and Gavin Newsom, and if she said she wouldn't run, so maybe not Gretchen Whitmer, but Josh Shapiro and Cory Booker and Amy Klobuchar and all these people who are very, very strong politicians, Gina Raimondo from within the administration, the Commerce Secretary, out there doing CNN and MSNBC town halls, going on podcasts, presumably this podcast, going to, every big YouTube show you can imagine, being on the late night shows, right? Doing debates with each other. And I think a lot of people in the party think, that would actually be really exciting. That'd be a really remarkable way to carry the Democratic message forward. So if they get to the point you're talking about, where they've already gone through as you put it, the trauma of pushing Biden aside, which, depending on how it goes, may not be that traumatic, but could be. I think at that point, they have cracked open, right? I think at that point there is we're in this now, and we may as well see it through. It's a little harder for me to believe. Now, I think the other version is Joe Biden could come in and say, I am stepping down, but I'm really asking all my delegates to back Harris. If he did that, I think he could push this towards a coronation, but that would be a decision he would be making, not that the party would be making.
But that this kind of, primaries, open convention, is that realistic in the time frame that's left for this election?
It's getting tighter and tighter. So we are on the eve of the Republican convention. It would not be crazy to have, you'd have about, imagine a world where Joe Biden jumps out at the end of the Republican convention, which I think is not super likely, but who knows? If you had about a month You could do a lot in a month if you wanted to, right? These are not primaries, right? These are people going, like, do you think CNN would not happily give over its programming for a couple of weeks so people can see these candidates in action? I think they would. So it could be a real blitz. But as you say, every day, and this is really Joe Biden's strategy for keeping the nomination, every day that goes by, it gets harder, right? Mm-hmm. Every day that goes by, the time gets shorter. If something happened where we had to drop out right before the convention, I think a Kamala Harris coronation becomes much likelier. Mm-hmm. It's a very frustrating situation for those of us who thought that Biden wasn't up to the job. I mean, there's a reason I was trying to make this argument around the turn of the year. You need time to do something like this well. Biden is potentially going to put the Democrats, no matter what he does at this point, in a very difficult situation.
And isn't the drawback of all this as well that it means people haven't focused? There's been almost no scrutiny of the much graver issue for the Republic, which is Donald Trump. And that is graver still in these days after the Supreme Court ruling in the case of presidential immunity, meaning since we're using the language of coronation and crowning, they are poised to make him have the powers of a king. But a real king rather than the one we have here. And meanwhile, the Democrats are talking about themselves. I mean, I think I can see it's essential, but this is also the downside of this moment, isn't it? That he's going by unscrutinized.
I don't believe this to be true. I think this is a thing that liberals have been telling themselves in a very weird way. Donald Trump, say what you will about the guy, he is anything but unscrutinized. He is almost unbelievably scrutinized. He's been the single main character of American politics day in, day out, including during Joe Biden's presidency since 2015. This idea Democrats have that there is some sort of new twist in the Donald Trump story that if only they could get people to focus in on. It's like you're going to tell people that Donald Trump is a Republican and they're all finally going to turn against him. There's been this argument among liberals that every column, inch, every tweet, any bit of energy going against Biden as a party standard bearer is energy that is not being spent making the case against Donald Trump. Democrats have not failed to make the case against Donald Trump. What they have failed to do is make the case for themselves. And the reason they are failing to make the case for themselves is they are running a profoundly flawed candidate whom a supermajority of the electorate has lost faith in. The single best thing Democrats could do is offer a product people liked more than Donald Trump. Because right now you have convinced most Americans who are going to be convinced in this way that Donald Trump is toxic, that he is toxic, right? If somebody has watched the last 8 years or more and not come to the conclusion that Donald Trump is beyond the pale, it's like they saw January 6th. They know about the criminal convictions, right? Like these are not small news events. This idea that like the mainstream media just hasn't covered it enough. One of my favorite polls this cycle is from NBC News, where they broke down voter preferences by media source. And what they find is that if you read traditional media, newspapers, things like that, you are absolutely highly likely to vote for Joe Biden. The further you get down the line, cable news, where Fox News is more dominant, social media, YouTube, do not follow the news, you become much more kind of Trump friendly. So there just is not this mechanism. We know in the battleground states, Democrats have been spending tens of millions of dollars on ads. Those ads have not hurt Donald Trump standing. Those ads are not working. At this point, there is a delta between who Democrats have convinced Donald Trump is bad and how many voters Democrats need. And you see this because in polls, the Senate candidates are running way ahead of Joe Biden. So there are a lot of voters who are willing to vote for a Democrat. Tammy Baldwin was just running 10 points ahead of Joe Biden in Wisconsin in her polls, in a Wisconsin poll rather. We've seen the same thing in other swing states. So I think Democrats have really talked themselves into a kind of insanity here. It is fine. It is good. I have written more columns and done more podcasts on how bad Donald Trump is than I can even want to remember. But they cannot win this election by convincing yet more people Donald Trump is bad. They have to actually convince people that their candidate is good. And this is a thing they have not wanted to do. And this has been the Biden's administration strategy, and it has been failing. This was the whole idea of the early June debate. Put Biden and Trump on a stage and people are going to finally remember what Donald Trump is. It did the opposite. At some point, Democrats have to stop doing the same thing over and over again here, only to be like, oh my God, it's not working. I mean, we're here on this podcast. just telling Israelis that Benjamin Netanyahu is bad, like, has that like worked out in Israeli politics for them?
Sometimes it has the boomerang effect.
Yes. You have to give people something they want to vote for. You can't just tell them how much you will hold them in contempt if they don't vote against the person you don't like. I'm all for making the case against Donald Trump, but it is not going to work if you do not give the electorate a candidate they want to vote for.
You have spent recently about 8 days in Israel. I think you were there when Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot left the coalition. There were other things going on. I kind of wonder, because obviously on our podcast, talking about Israel from the inside out and the Jewish community, we have been seeing the war and seeing October 7th sometimes in similar ways and sometimes in very different ones. And I kind of wonder if, as an Israeli, I think the one thing that happened to us was our lives were upended, right? So many things that we believed about who we are just sort of shifted, changed, crashed. And I wonder if for you, when you look at what you thought about Israel, what you thought about the Palestinians, what you thought about the conflict, has any of that shifted or just coalesced for you?
I'd say it has coalesced more than shifted.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the fundamental tragedy of it is I can feel it all more seriously than I could before and more intensely than I could before I went. I had intended by now to release like a big show, an essay on this, and the Biden news has made that fall down the schedule. I always describe my trip to Israel to people as prismatic, that every day I was with people with whom I was fully sympathetic and whose needs and whose stories were completely contradictory and irreconcilable with the people I saw the day before. I go to this with certain biases and I go to this with certain affinities, right? I'm a Jewish American. My first trip out of the country after going to Brazil, where my family is from, was to Israel. I've been to Israel before, right? So there's certain things that are easier for me to see, and certain people it's like more intuitive for me to sympathize with. But even given that, I will say that I think one of the profound challenges Israelis now face is that if you are an outside observer and you walk into the situation in the West Bank, you are visibly shocked by it. It looks like and feels like the American South in the 50s, in the Jim Crow era. The just visible differences in infrastructure, the water tanks on Palestinian homes, but not in Israeli settlements. I knew all this, and yet I was not actually prepared for how visible it was before me. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I think something that people here do not appreciate is what it feels like up on the northern border of Israel with Lebanon, right? Going there, seeing these burnt out villages. I was up in Kiryat Shmona when the fires were raging, talking to the firefighters up there. The other thing that struck me quite profoundly, was how conflicted Israeli society feels to me about security. Mm-hmm. If you think about the security risks that people are facing there, you can imagine a set of policies that would address it. One of the things that I think people elsewhere who think of Israel primarily in terms of Israelis and Palestinians don't appreciate is how much Israelis understand the profound threat to be from Iran. But of course, if you do think the profound threat is from a legacy imperialistic country with patient, strategic, regionally hegemonic ambitions that is actually a serious player, what you would want is very strong international alliances. I kept hearing from people there, it's like this Iranian, Chinese, Russian axis, which like whether or not I fully buy that, if you do believe you're facing an Iranian, Russian, Chinese axis, how strong your relationship is with the Europe-America axis would really matter. But of course, Israeli leadership is not making decisions to strengthen that relationship right now. I also felt very strongly when I was in the West Bank that things like the cutting off of tax revenues to the PA were just obviously making some kind of uprising or violence much likelier. And you could just feel that with people not being paid there on the Palestinian side. So there is this confusion. Like the security situation is very threatening and real. And on the other hand, it is not in my view, polity making like the difficult strategic decisions you would make on those counts. There are other agendas being pursued amidst all of these dangers. And it felt in that way, it felt very fractured, right? You expect in a way to find coherence. And like the last thing I found across the entire trip, no matter where I was, which side I was talking to, there is not coherence. There is not unity. There is not leadership with clear plans, right? It's a genuine situation of fog and fracture.
I think that chimes with a lot of what we've been hearing on the podcast ourselves over the last 9 months. I want to pick up on a conversation you had on the Ezra Klein show with Yonit's colleague, Amit Segel, famously sort of leading voice of the Israeli right. That's how you build him. And he more or less said the ideas that I would, venture to say that you or someone like me would hold about Israel and how it should operate are discredited. And he went through very methodically saying how those ideas have been discredited, whether that's a bilateral accord between Israelis and Palestinians, discredited by the Oslo experience, a unilateral withdrawal by Israel, like the disengagement from Gaza, discredited. And he more or less sort of said everything that people like you, Ezra, and I would include myself in that, believe, that's all been discredited. We're the people with the energy now. I'm just wondering whether any of it echoes a bit what Yonit was asking before, whether that in any way persuaded you or shifted you, made you think, yeah, actually the ideas that I still like have been discredited. People like me need to think again.
I'd say two things. So one, I would slightly frame my read of what Amit said, although I don't want to speak for him, differently, which is that I also felt he kind of admitted that his ideas were also discredited, that there was no idea left. That is how I read that description, right? That on the one hand, yes, bilateral accords, people have lost faith in that, right? The Israeli narrative is we tried a peace process and we got the second intifada. Then there's the withdrawal idea, right? That has been discredited. Whether you really believe that Gaza was a kind of, self-governing entity that Israel did not have control over, which I think is more arguable than he would like to admit. Nevertheless, it is completely clear to me in Israeli society, the idea that you're just going to withdraw and allow, these Palestinian states to arise, that is discredited. On the other hand, as I said to him, are you just saying endless occupation? That's not going to work either. Nobody believes you can do that. Nobody's actually arguing for that in public, but nobody's arguing for anything, right? I mean, I think I did sometimes find it almost refreshing to talk to the people who are a little bit closer to people like Smotrich, because at least they have a plan that describes something like the reality I am seeing that they are trying to enact, right? They're at least willing to describe to me this is what we're doing and this is how we're doing it. But nobody really seems to think their plan is going to succeed. So I did not come thinking that anybody's got an idea. What I came thinking was that every idea has currently been discredited. And as is often the case when that happens, something is going to have to change, either through events or through time. But I wouldn't venture to guess what that will be.
I'm interested in this because, you've been doing a lot of conversations about Israel, about what has been going on here, about Hamas, since October 7th. You care about Israel. You care about the region. You care what happens to its people, Israelis, Palestinians. How worried should we be as Israelis, or should I be as an Israeli, that the other young Jewish Americans will care less and less because they just don't want to be bothered by this mess?
Yeah, I think this is happening. Mm-hmm. Or at least you could say it is bifurcating, right? There are young Jews in America who face with rising anti-Semitism, which really is a thing, and also faced with the sense of threat for Israel, have become more embrace of it. And there are many who feel that to support Israel is to be asked to choose between their political values and this country that they do not actually live in. And they do not actually have any power over, they do not actually have a vote in. And they are going to choose, in the old exit, voice, and loyalty framework, they are going to choose when they are choosing exit. It is uncomfortable to be a supporter of Israel on an American college campus now. Not impossible. It's not like you run out of there with pitchforks, but Zionist has become a kind of slur, right? And the thing that sustained, and remember, American, you know this very well, but American Jews are extremely liberal and still are. Mm-hmm. The thing that sustained that connection for so long, the sort of compatibility between the diasporatic, liberal American Jewish identity and Israel, was that there was this liberal Israeli society you could latch onto. Maybe it wasn't always the one in charge or winning, but it was there. I mean, I remember it used to be said all the time in American politics, like, oh, like the range of debate in Israel is wider, than it is in America, even over Israel, right? Like Haaretz could say things that the New York Times would never say. And that's not true anymore. And the sense that I think there are people who would really welcome other kinds of leadership that felt very different. But I also think that Benny Gantz is not exactly, or at least his coalition is not going to prove exactly what liberal Jews are hoping to see. Mm-hmm. But the possibility of schism, of sort of diasporic and Zionist identities becoming irreconcilable, where people in Israel are as I often hear, right, you don't know what it's like to live here. Like easy for you to say from a podcast studio. Like I have a joke that every Meretz voter in Israel has emailed me, and it's always the same email. It's like, look, I voted for Meretz, but but in the long run, if you think about these questions like Iran, the sort of international allegiances, like would Israel have under a younger democratic president the access to arms and weaponry that it has had under this democratic president in 7 years under similar conditions? I think not. Mm-hmm. And so there's a real question here of how this plays out. And by the way, even on the right, I mean, if you look at people who are a little bit younger there, like Vivek Ramaswamy, and also to say nothing of the growing isolationist dimensions of the right, there's also more skepticism among young people on the right about Israel. So, I mean, Israel right now is drafting off of a generational politics in America where the president happens to be of the generation that is most pro-Israeli. But, the situation that younger people see who have only known Netanyahu's Israel is very, very different. And you can't rely on younger people never getting power or positions of authority in America.
No, I think all of that makes very good sense. I want to ask you about two things which I think might be linked, but it's up to you whether you want to see a link between them. I mean, the first one is, in terms of that disenchantment of liberal opinion, I would say it's not just America, it's around the world, from Israel. I have sensed an acceleration of that since the ICJ case and the normalization of the word genocide being attached to Israel. And that word on every placard or the university protest and everything has accelerated that kind of decoupling or distancing of liberal sentiment from Israel. And I would also say from Jews, because Jews are somehow seen as being defenders or apologists or advocates for this regime, which has now got this mark of Cain on it of genocide with this ICJ stamp. That's one piece. The other piece is this trauma would be perhaps putting it too strong, but this shock that was felt by a lot of liberal Jews around the world after October the 7th, when there wasn't that much sympathy from other liberals and leftists for the Jewish pain at that moment. And you mentioned this rise in anti-Semitism, which is real, and we're very used to chanting that on the right. But people have seen something of that on the left as well. And I was just keen to know, first, this new mood about Israel, how does that affect you? Because I feel it affects me very much. But also, what has it felt like for you as a kind of somebody who is, totemic figure in the American liberal left conversation, when your own side, as it were, your own political family, now has room for views which could be described as anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic?
A lot in there. Let me start with the second piece of what I think are sort of four pieces in there, which is the question of what happened right after October 7th. I think that Israelis, many Jews, have done themselves a terrible disservice by seeing the dumbest person on Columbia's campus as more reflective of political opinion than the entirety of the American political establishment, media, frankly, any establishment or anyone with power at all. Right after October 7th, I do not agree that there was not profound sympathy for Israel. I think it was profound sympathy for Israel. I think that it was meaningful how rapidly Joe Biden went to Israel, right? That America moved warships to make sure that Iran would not threaten Israel, right? Most countries that suffer even terribly violent tragedies do not get this kind of support from America.
But again, as you said before,
that
was Biden rather than young liberal
No, but
opinion.
see, that part I don't agree. I think then, and I was covering the politics of this right then, what Biden was doing was completely within the center of the politics. It was over time Israel to change the subject from October 7th to what was happening after October 7th, right? Many people, myself, not that I matter in this, Tom Friedman, others, said, don't do what we did after 9/11. Don't engage in such an overwhelming response that you immediately lose control of the narrative, of the story. Don't become the aggressor when you're the victim. Don't do it too fast. Think very hard about how you do this. Use limited counterterrorism strategies, right? That was not done. I think I can understand why within the context of Israeli politics and even Israeli strategy, it was not done. But nevertheless, what happened then was not just predictable, it was predicted, right? Which is at a certain point, it took longer. But at some point, people were not like, oh, America suffered 9/11. It's why the hell are you in Iraq? What are you doing? What are you going to gain from this? It accelerated. And I do think there's a thing where social media accelerates these dynamics now. I've wondered many times what would have been the politics of the American response after 9/11 if it had been the social media era. But I don't agree that there was no sympathy to draft off of, that the only immediate thing was anti-Semitism. There was anti-Semitism, but there was profound sympathy and solidarity that was then slowly degraded, wrecked. And by the way, Netanyahu bears a tremendous amount of blame here too. The things he said, the things people in his cabinet said, the way he treated Biden, right? But frankly, by the way, the way he treated Obama years ago, which had done a lot to sever the connection between the Democratic Party and Israel. Okay, you asked me a more personal question, and I'll try to not dodge it, which is, how has this felt to me? One is that it's felt extraordinarily painful. It's painful inside of me, right? I have very conflicted feelings around my own Judaism, around Israel, right? Around what, if we're asking this spiritually, what is this religion for? If you have a religion that is fundamentally exilic, right? It has been so much about being a stranger and what it means to be a stranger, and is so unable to wield power more responsibly when it does get a home, right? Where was our protection, right? Ethically. And I don't mean here in a response to October 7th. I mean here in what I see in the West Bank. I mean here in Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and people who have real power, right? For all the talk of protesters on campus, Ben-Gvir is actually a member of the cabinet and really did have a picture of a genuine terrorist up in his home. It chills me. And also, I fear that I lived in an area where there were times when I had to change where I was walking because of the anti-Israeli protests. The synagogue I take my children to for Tot Shabbat was defaced. I don't know what to say about this because I don't think that Israel, like any country, could make all of its decisions based on, what happens in terms of currents of anti-Semitism elsewhere in the world. But there's definitely a connection. It's part of why I feel connected to Israel. It's in some ways whether you want to be connected to it or not, as a Jew of the diaspora, you are. And also I am, right? It's where, a huge percentage of worldwide Jewry resides. It's a country I feel a deep personal connection to. And it's a genuine tragedy. I'm deeply sympathetic. Look, I will say this, and I keep saying it, what America did after 9/11 was worse, and it was dumber, and it was bigger, right? An attack like that, and where there are still attacks, it's not like we had somebody lobbing missiles at us from Canada during, the 8 months later. You're not going to have a polity making these kinds of restrained decisions under those conditions. At this point, in our post 9/11 evolution, we had not yet invaded Iraq. Our worst mistakes were yet to come. We were still in a kind of derangement. We were still, I think, not yet renaming French fries in the cafeteria of Congress freedom fries because we were so mad that the French had not supported the dumbest thing we had ever done or would ever do. So I think there's a real question of where things are in 5 years, right? Where they are in 10 years. If you're, you live on the northern border or you live in Gaza, you don't have the luxury of thinking in these long time frames. But politically, I think that where things are now is unsustainable. So the question of where they will go is also unknowable, but it's going to go somewhere. Not necessarily towards solution. It could get worse, but I don't think this is a stable equilibrium.
That's about Israel and what is going on there. And you touched a little bit about, anti-Semitism at home and what you think about it, what you feel about that. Do you think that there will be some sort of, that will subside somehow? Or is what we saw erupting in the US is there to stay?
This is hard to say because it depends what we are talking about. And here I think are we talking about anti-Semitic violence? I think that that is not going to, I don't believe that is going to erupt into some sort of full-blown set of pogroms, or I do not feel endangered. I feel a little bit endangered sometimes just being, when some of the emails I get, et cetera, just being a very prominent Jewish person talking about Israel a lot in the media. But I don't feel endangered walking around. That's not my experience of it. I think there's been too much focus on campus protests, just one, full stop. But also there tends to be a focus on like the worst people you could find at a protest who are always quite bad. Whereas like the bulk of these protests are, in my view, anti-Israel, but not anti-Semitic. I do think that there's like a very dangerous game that has been played for a long time, which is to try to rule a lot of criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic in an effort to suppress it. Dynamics of suppression are a major topic of like my first book, Why We're Polarized. And it's often a very, very effective strategy. It is what Democrats are doing with Joe Biden's age. You can take something where people have, opinions are very worried about, and you can suppress those opinions, and it might work for some period of time. But eventually when suppression breaks, when it's no longer sustainable, it breaks very badly. And my worry is that like there's still a real effort to suppress what has happened among basically younger people, which is that there's been a collapse in support for Israel because the only Israel they have known is not, from a liberal perspective, a supportable Israel. And here I mean like a fundamental liberal perspective. Like Israel is at this moment illiberal. It is has an illiberal government. It has many, many people who live under fundamentally its control who do not have a vote in it. It is not defensible as a liberal project right now. And there's been a lot of, well, if you don't support it as this, you're anti-Semitic. And a lot of people, okay, I'm not anti-Semitic. I'm not going to talk about this. I don't want to be involved in this. And then October 7th, and this was Hamas's horrific genius, created a huge salience in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what Hamas has done is goad Israel into an overwhelming attack that has raised the salience of the underlying conflict. And a lot of people looked at it and said, I don't support what's there. And if you give me the choice, if you keep telling me that to fundamentally disbelieve in what Israel is now is to be anti-Semitic, some percentage of people are going to be like, okay, I take the choice. I take the bargain you're offering. That scares me. It scares me for Israel. It scares me for my family. It scares me for what Judaism is in America, because Judaism in America has been very built around Zionism for a long time. What is its spiritual structure if it loses that connection? So this feels very dangerous, tender. The work that is going to have to be done politically and culturally is really profound. I don't know where it goes, but that feels to me like what it is.
So we've covered a lot of difficult stuff in this conversation. You always close out by asking your guests to pick 3 books. We're going to do something a little different, if we could, which is to ask you for 3 things that are, to quote the old Ian Dury song, reasons to be cheerful, but 3 things that may give you some grounds, if any, for optimism about, it can be about America, it can be about Jews, it can be the human race, but are there 3 things that at least give you some heart? And you can do 1 if that's too hard.
No, I can do 3. I'm not that. I consider myself neither optimistic or pessimistic, but I don't see the world as merely an endless procession of grim news stories. My first would be technological progress. Particularly the unbelievable advances in clean energy over the past 2 decades have made it not easy to do something to ameliorate the worst of climate change, but has made it possible without the only answer being endless sacrifice. And also to shown that even with a quite lackluster policy response in many ways, we can harness human genius in the direction of our worst problems, and we should take some real lessons from that. You saw a similar thing happening with warp speed and the vaccines. It turns out that actually, if we want to mobilize technology in the direction of our hardest problems, we really can. If we had not seen solar, battery, and wind power costs falling in the exponential ways they have been falling over the past 15 years, the path forward on climate change would be flatly impossible, and we'd be facing down the worst of it. Worldwide, there continues to be continuing drops in extreme poverty. Like, this is a big deal. It matters that people are getting richer. I worry about the slowdown in China, but you've continued seeing important movement in India, in Bangladesh, and places like that. So that is always encouraging to me. And yeah, I think most human beings are fundamentally good. And even when I was tore in terrible conflicts, like in Israel recently, most of the people you meet, I think, want decent lives, to live in peace. We get warped. The worst among us have outsized power. There's a real veto that can be exercised by murderers, by terrorists, by even political spoilers. But I think human beings are complicated, and there's a lot of goodness in them too. And so, I do try to hold that fairly close. Like, that's a little bit cliche and trackley, and it doesn't take away from how hard problems are to solve. As you heard me say earlier, I do not believe there's somehow solutions next to us, but I also don't believe that the fundamental nature of human beings is such that solutions cannot eventually be found in even really difficult conflicts. So I don't move through the world in an endless fog of pessimism, or at least I hope I don't.
And you left us with some reasons to be optimistic, at the very least. Ezra Klein, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you. I really appreciated it.
Thank you, Ezra. He's a very interesting man and thinker, and I found him very persuasive on the Biden question, because some of the concerns that I've picked up, around, well, what comes next, I think he deals with those. He's obviously thought about it and deals with those very well. I mean, this notion particularly of, there being a contest, that's something that he, I think, makes a good case that Democrats don't need to fear that. Actually, in some ways, it could be, I've been thinking myself, it could be very energizing, getting a lot of attention. And similarly, this point about, which the Biden White House is pushing strongly, every day you're attacking me, you're not attacking Trump. And his observation that, well, look, we've been doing that for years and Trump was ahead in the polls anyway. So let's get our own positive thing right. That was the case he was making in February. It's not enough to say Trump is awful. People know that. You've got to give them something to say yes to, as well as something to say no to. I found him very persuasive on that.
Yes, I think also on the issue of, anti-Semitism, I rarely heard him talk this personal. It was interesting to me because he was asked in 2011 by Moment magazine, what does it mean to be Jewish today? And he talks and he says, there have been times when the Jewish experience was unified, usually in tragic ways, and presenting oneself as Jewish required more of a choice. But in my generation, Jews are all over and doing far too much. I can simply be Jewish. I have the luxury of refusing to answer for the rest of my tribe. These are more carefree words. I think he talked very differently in the conversation that we had with him. Now, one more point, it is difficult for Israeli ears to hear that comparison, going through the West Bank and saying this is the Jim Crow laws. And the first thing that an Israeli, in their mind, and I was definitely thinking this during the interview, wanting to say, it's not our fault. Like, we tried to solve this, all the usual Israeli explanations. We tried to solve this. We went to the peace process. The Palestinians didn't show up. All of that, fine. I think what's important here is for us to realize this is the view held by Jewish, American, liberal, prominent, figures. So that is something to note as well. I couldn't think of a better person to have on vis-a-vis the Biden turmoil, and also, his visit to Israel, which I think brought up a lot of interesting points in our conversation.
Yeah, and he speaks, doesn't he, partly generationally. I mean, he's younger, and he was, the way he put it, maybe at the milder end of what a lot of people like him and his, generation would think. So we have some awards to give out.
We do, and I think the first mensch nominee of the week will be Noga Weiss. Noga was kidnapped from Kibbutz Be'eri on October 7th. She was in captivity with her mother for 50 days. Her father, Ilan, was murdered. And she came back. All this did not prevent her from enlisting in the military. She could have said because of her situation, that she doesn't want to, but she did. The same military that, disappointed her and her family, but it's still the backbone of Israeli society in every way. And yesterday, a picture of her graduating with honors from a military course was published. She's smiling. She's among her friends. And it's something, whatever happened to these Israelis in captivity is something that will always live in them and always live in this society. But the fact that she's 18, she's young, she's living her life, she's managed to get up and continue. And this picture made Israelis of all walks of life, I think, smile seeing it.
No, that's a very good nomination. I was going to also chip in with Yehuda Fuchs, who stepped down as a senior IDF commander this week for the speech he made in stepping down, in which he talked about, because his last post was as commander in the West Bank, and he took on the settlers in particular. He said, "To my great disappointment, nationalist crime has reared its head, and under the desire for revenge, it has sown chaos and fear in Palestinian residents who did not pose any threat." So he was attacking those particularly sort of militant settlers who have resorted to violence. But then what was important was he then turned to what he called the local and spiritual leadership, meaning some of those right-wing politicians and rabbis who, as far as he's concerned, have encouraged or allowed this to happen, who either remained silent or sort of nurtured this. And he said that this is not Judaism to me, at least not the one I grew up with in my father and mother's house. This is not the way of the Torah. It is about adopting the enemy's tactics and walking in their rules. In other words, he's accusing some of those violent militant settlers and the people behind them, rabbis and politicians, of sinking to the level of some of the very people who would constitute Israel's enemies. I thought it was a very, brave thing for him to say. He got attacked very predictably from the far right, who called him, one of them saying goodbye and see you never. And the criticism would also be, a bit late to say this now, but obviously he wasn't free to talk politically when he was in post and is now. And I think at least somebody is making some of those arguments that people are uncomfortable to hear, but people need to hear.
Incredibly serious general. And remember, this is one of the commander of the Central Command in Israel, one of the more complicated jobs in the military. I remind you, Yehuda Fuchs is the same man who talked after Hawara when there were extreme settlers attacking Palestinians. He called it a pogrom. Again, stretching the lines of what uniform-wearing military general can or can't say. And this, I would also add to what he said in his speech. And although this is not at all, the Gaza command is not his responsibility, he also said, apologize. He's part of the military, top brass. He apologized for what happened on October 7th.
I wonder if he'll be one of those former generals who we see again in politics in the country. You never know. But and you're absolutely right to highlight that use by him of the word pogrom, which went round the world and was, again, very important moment. So two nominees there in our mensch category. For chutzpah, I thought we would highlight the ultra-Orthodox rabbis who this week issued a letter against the military draft, against the compulsory conscription, which I say again, we say it so many times here, is imposed on every other Jewish Israeli, but which, for historic reasons, the ultra-Orthodox have been exempt. They've issued a letter because they fear that this conscription could be coming for them. And the language of it is very interesting. It talks about destruction. It talks about young men sort of falling. It talks about people being displaced, but does not use that language to talk about the war in which young men, young women were killed in uniform. It does not use that language to talk about those people, Gazans, who were displaced in their thousands from the war. And it just struck me that I know, and we talked about it at the time, a lot of people took great exception when we had, as our guest on the podcast, Rivka Ravitz, sort of leading light of the ultra-Orthodox community, who said to us, look, of course we can't let our young men go and serve. I know of people, cousins in my own family who went and served, and they came back secular. They didn't wear a kippah anymore. And a lot of listeners were outraged because they wanted to shout at their phone or however they're listening to say, well, our cousins came back dead in a coffin. The biggest problem was not that they did not have a kippah. They were killed in the line of protecting everyone, including you, they would say to the ultra-Orthodox. Mm-hmm. And so here again is that sort of tin ear on the part of the ultra-Orthodox, not even realizing how it sounds to use the language of destruction and people falling and people being displaced, when there is a real war going on that they are very adamant that they have to remain protected from. So I think a chutzpah award to the ultra-Orthodox authors of that letter.
681 soldiers, men and women, were killed on October 7th and since in the Gazan war. And the more this number tragically gets higher, this argument within Israeli society is going to grow deeper. And that connects to our conversation earlier in the show of Netanyahu's, the fate of Netanyahu's government. I'm just going to add, if I may, as an addendum to the Chutzpah Award this week, Jonathan himself, who is going to be leaving us for a few weeks. As we said, we did talk about this a while back, that you will be going on book hiatus, but leaving me
2
in
weeks,
the...
I think.
Sorry?
I'm just signaling that it's only 2 weeks, not a few.
Okay.
It's 2.
Well, I don't know. It sounds like a lot to me. So I'm going to say a few. Okay. And I'm the one staying. So I'm going to do what I want. And to say that I will be left in the very capable, safe, fantastic hands of two glorious co-hosts that will be stepping up to the plate from next week. Do you want to say who they are?
I don't think we need to be coy. I mean, friends of the podcast extraordinaire, David Remnick, editor-in-chief of the New Yorker magazine, and Biana Golodriga, anchor on CNN, both good friends of this podcast, brilliant thinkers and broadcasters, writers, and they will be in my chair. Not literally, because that could be awkward if I'm trying to write a book and I'm hosting people who've flown in to host Unholy. So but they'll be in the metaphorical chair, and I think I could not feel like I'm leaving my half of the hosting responsibilities in more capable hands.
What I didn't hear in this conversation is, I'm sorry, Yonit, but I'll wait. It's fine. I can wait 2 weeks for that.
I'm grateful, certainly, that you're allowing me some time to get right on this book. But I am also grateful to you and to them for holding the fort.
So we're really looking forward to Biana and David coming on, and we shall say our thank yous. First of all, big mazal tov to Omer Prima, to our team, our staff member got married this week, still showed up for a recording. That's pretty amazing. And then a big thank you to Guy Glazer and Snir Yamin and to Omri Barak. And Jonathan, I'll see you in August. What can I say?
Yeah, I'm just checking out right now. See you then. It won't be long.